Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I speak to Rise on behalf of the Green Party on the budget policy statement debate in this Parliament. Now, the Green Party put forward its own economic plan in the lead up to the election, a plan for a smart green economy, and that's one where we take our national debt, and particularly our current account deficit, seriously, but also seek to transform our economy and deal with the fact that our export sector is in real trouble. Now, this government, the National Government, when they came in, when they were first elected, they inherited an economy that was out of balance. There's no question about it. It had much too much debt, particularly private debt. The public sector debt was in a good position. The previous government had actually run a surplus, but the private sector debt was very much out of control, and the tradable sector was in real trouble. Since then, they were rocked by some serious external factors which had nothing to do with them, particularly the earthquakes in Christchurch, but more generally the global financial crisis and, of course, the European crisis. So in a sense, you could say they had some real challenges. The other way to look at it was that they had some real opportunities to remake our economy, to put it on a more sustainable footing. An economy that saves more, an economy that invests in productive enterprise more, an economy that creates jobs in the emerging clean tech sector, an economy with a Christchurch rebuilt to be one of the most green tech and sustainable cities in the world. That was one of the opportunities, and many of the opportunities that were in front of the government. Now, the thing is, when you inherit an economy that has some fundamental problems, you do have a window of opportunity to fix it. It is that one moment when powerful vested interests, who have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo, are open to acting differently because the status quo isn't working. Now, our view is that the government has not used this opportunity well to reform the New Zealand economy in some quite fundamental aspects. Firstly, there's the question of the deficit. Now, the government's national signature economic policy was their tax cut package, which was introduced in 2010. It was a policy that was designed before the global financial crisis and before the Christchurch earthquakes. And it was a policy that was totally wrong for the time that it was introduced after those events. Tax cuts failed to stimulate the economy because they weren't tax cuts to low-income earners, they primarily went to upper-income earners, and it didn't stimulate the economy at the time it needed it the most. The other side of it was that it crashed the budget. Because it was not fiscally neutral, it meant that at a time when the government actually needed more revenue, it threw more revenue away. Now that, in my opinion, is not smart economic management. The fiscal crisis the government is currently facing is a problem of large degree of their own making because of the tax cut policy that they pursued in the 2010 budget, a policy that was designed before the GFC and before the Christchurch earthquakes. Figures from the Crown's year-end financial statements 2010-11 show that National's 2010 tax package has cost the government $1.1 billion in the first 9 months. So it cost $1.1 billion in the first 9 months. Now, most of that cost is due to the reduction from the 38-cent to the 33-cent top tax rate, which benefited the top 10% of New Zealanders. Now, the signature economic policy for the national government, the tax cuts for those on high incomes largely, has not been fiscally neutral. Cuts have crashed the government's revenue at a critical moment, and in my opinion, that is a failure of good economic management. National were handed a once-in-an-economic cycle opportunity to institute a comprehensive tax on capital gains. The crisis that the government inherited created the opportunity in which they could move the tax system to a more sustainable footing, and they failed to take advantage of that. A capital gains tax would remove the unfair tax advantages for investment in property over more productive measures. The government did actually change some of the rules around taxing property, and I congratulate them for that, but they failed to introduce a capital gains tax excluding the family home. They chose to ignore the conventional wisdom of just about all economists, the OECD, the IMF, the government's own savings working group, and so no surprise that as our weak economic recovery is emerging at the moment, we're finding it's concentrated in the housing sector, the very sector where we don't need another bubble, and the reason it's happening is because the government refused to change the tax incentives around investment in housing. Our tepid economic recovery that we're experiencing at the moment looks nothing like the export-led recovery that we actually need. We need the tradable sector to do well. Now, part of this is linked to the hands-off approach when it comes to the exchange rate. A recent business operations survey by Statistics New Zealand found that high and highly volatile New Zealand dollar was the #1 barrier that our exporters face. That's what they said. The same survey shows that the number of businesses exporting has remained flat under 4 years of this government. The high Kiwi dollar has been damaging our tradable sector, the lifeblood of a sustainable, resilient economy. Now, as far back as June 2009, the Reserve Bank Governor was uncomfortable with the stronger currency, telling his board that the high New Zealand dollar would not deliver the rebalancing we need in the New Zealand economy. Since then, the Kiwi dollar has appreciated a further 28% against the US dollar, while the trade-weighted index, which is an attempt to kind of compare the Kiwi against lots of other currencies based on how important they are to us as a tradable sector, the trade-weighted index is up 21%. So if we want our export and our import competing sectors to thrive, to help pay our way in the world, we're going to need to address our high and highly volatile exchange rate. Now, our trading partners haven't taken a hands-off approach to their exchange rate. If you look at Japan, the United States, the UK, they've all engaged a suite of measures to actively manage their currencies. The IMF even recently backed Switzerland's most unorthodox use of quantitative easing, one of probably the most unorthodox exchange rate management policies we've seen for many decades. The IMF said that, quote unquote, it was appropriate in the circumstances because the Swiss franc was getting so high it was destroying the tradable sector of the Swiss economy. I wish our government would take some notice of that. Other countries have introduced new domestic capital requirements on banks and controls on foreign capital to try to dampen some of the wild swings in their exchange rate. The global financial crisis has changed the world as we know it and the rules as to what is acceptable monetary policy and fiscal policy, but no one, it seems, has told the government. So our exporting sector and our tradable sector has been left high and dry by the government's non-interventionist approach to economic management. It hasn't worked. Now, perhaps many aspects of the government's policy I think we could disagree with, but selling the state-owned enterprises, so the privatisation program the government's engaged in, is not only, it's bad fiscal policy as well as bad economic policy. And fiscal policy is, of course, the management of the government's own budget, whereas economic policy refers to the broader impact on the New Zealand economy. Now, the way the government has sold the privatisation, they've deliberately tried to confuse debt with deficit in order to try to confuse the argument. In the short term, selling these companies will have a negative impact on the government's deficit. That's a very important thing to think about. Why is it that we have a debt problem, a public debt problem? It's because we have a deficit problem and we have to overcome our deficit problem. Selling the assets makes our deficit problem worse. That's because, of course, that the cost of borrowing to the government is much lower than the return on these investments. So actually we're in a worse position. And so hanging on to these assets not only is good for the fiscal position, it's also good for the economic position of New Zealand. Because fundamentally these companies, these clean green companies, which is not all of them are, but a significant number of them are part of what could be New Zealand's economic future. There is a growing clean energy sector globally, and if the climate change science is right, and I've got every reason to think that it is, then the clean tech sector, the clean energy sector is only going to grow and grow. And New Zealand is right now in a great position to take advantage of that. But if these companies fall into overseas ownership, they will move the headquarters overseas, the research and development overseas, and we will become a profit centre for another multinational company which owns these companies rather than the centre of a sector that's exporting clean technology to the world. One of the key aspects in all of this which is not getting the attention it should deserve is the current account deficit. Because if we do not deal with our current account deficit, we will enter a worse and worse spiral. Current projections are for the current account deficit to go towards 6.9% of GDP in a couple of years. That is a huge problem. The only way you service a current account deficit is to sell assets or to take on more debt. And each time you do that, you solve your current account problem for this year, but you make next year's current account deficit worse, because then you have higher debt repayments and you lose all the dividends on those payments. So the fact that the government hasn't addressed the current account deficit problem, I think, is a fundamental fail on the part of the government. Until they address that problem, they cannot claim to be good economic managers of New Zealand, and clearly on the fiscal side they're failing there as well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Dr. Nick Smith.